Washington tonight, we know President Trump's very first reaction to the appointment of a special counsel in 2017 was as dramatic as it was revealing. That moment of political terror captured in Mueller's report today showed a president realizing how much his life of cutting corners could now be coming back to haunt him. Trump said, "Oh, my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed." That reaction certainly rings true in light of the news today that special counsel Robert Mueller believed he had a case of obstruction of justice against President Trump. Despite abundant evidence, Mueller declined to prosecute, however, because of his view that a sitting president should not be indicted, nor even officially accused while in office. The reason we're only hearing this today is because of the 4-week effort by Attorney General William Barr to keep Mueller's findings about obstruction of justice from us. It was not until earlier today that Barr even admitted that he disagreed with the special counsel on the obstruction matter.
Although the Deputy Attorney General and I disagreed with some of the special counsel's legal theories and felt that some of the episodes examined did not amount to obstruction as a matter of law, we did not rely solely on that in making our decision.
Despite the Attorney General's attempts to blunt the impact of today's revelations, the Mueller report speaks volumes about the president's misconduct, detailing numerous efforts to control, curtail, and otherwise kill the Mueller investigation. One significant episode occurred in June of 2017 when the president twice directed White House counsel Don McGahn to fire the special counsel, telling McGahn in one instance that Mueller has to go. Call me back when you do it. Well, instead, McGahn decided to resign, telling Reince Priebus that the president asked him to do crazy stuff. Well, the report finds that Trump was clearly trying to shield himself from further inquiry at that point. Quote, substantial evidence indicates that the president's attempts to remove the special counsel were linked to the special counsel's oversight of investigations that involved the president's conduct. Mueller cites numerous other examples of the president's meddling in the investigation, including his attempts to limit its scope and his encouragement to witnesses not to cooperate. And while there's much more in the report, the Mueller report, which stands at almost 450 pages in total, the evidence of obstruction is substantial and could serve as a roadmap for the U.S. Congress moving forward. In fact, in declining to accuse the president of a crime, Mueller's team pointed to the role of Congress to impeach the president, saying a criminal accusation against a sitting president would potentially preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct. Wow. I'm joined right now by Cynthia Axne and Paul Butler. Both are former federal prosecutors, and also NBC's Pete Williams, who's at the Justice Department. Pete, lay out the litany. It was wonderful at Nightly tonight. I saw it. Do it again. What's the charge made by Mueller about obstruction of justice? His laying it out.
Well, he goes through 10 episodes that he says were investigated as potential obstruction of justice events. Many of them we know, and we knew in advance that they would be those that happened in public. The firing of Comey, urging Comey to go easy on the investigation of Michael Flynn. One of the things that was a bit surprising in the report is it said that what seemed to bother the president the most about James Comey and firing him was that Comey steadfastly refused to say that the president wasn't under investigation, despite being repeatedly asked to do so. So they go through all those, the couple that you've mentioned, McGahn urging Lewandowski, the former campaign manager, to have Jeff Sessions say that the Mueller investigation had concluded the president didn't do anything wrong. And at the end of the day, though, they say they didn't charge, they didn't say the president obstructed justice. But I think you put your finger on the key part of this disagreement between the Attorney General and Mueller. The report strongly suggests, it doesn't come right out and say it in so many words, but the strong implication is that the Mueller team believed there was evidence of obstruction of justice. Barr, in describing it in his letter last month, said that Mueller concluded that the evidence was ambiguous and it pointed in both directions. And indeed, there are parts of the report that say that. But the very first page of the report says that fundamentally, the Mueller team concluded that the president could not be charged with the crime because of the longstanding Justice Department policy that said that would be unconstitutional. So that's the disagreement here. The report strongly suggests that the Mueller team believed that the reason they didn't go all the way and say obstruction of justice was because they couldn't. And what Barr has said, and said today, by the way, that Mueller told him last month that it was the fact that the evidence was inconclusive and pointed in both directions. That was the reason Mueller didn't make a call on obstruction of justice, that it was not the disagreement or the problem with the longstanding policy against indicting a sitting president.
Wow. Well, that's murky as hell. Thank you so much. That facts are real, but my God, thank you, Pete Williams, for the great reporting. Paul Butler, the whole question to most people watching right now is, is there a case for the Congress to take up now? Have they been handed the goods?
They have. We learned from the Mueller report that President Trump did everything in his power to try to impede the Russian investigation. And the only reason he didn't stop the investigation is because his staff just said no. The president asked 11 different people to do unethical or illegal things to try to halt Mueller's investigation, and they all said no. For the law, though, you don't actually have to succeed in stopping an investigation in order to be guilty of obstruction. All you have to do is try. The difficult case for prosecutors with obstruction is how you prove criminal intent. Ill motive that the subject knew he was doing something wrong. Here we have President Trump not only asking people to break the law, but then afterwards saying lie about it. So he told McGahn, yes, I tried to fire Mueller, but if you're asking the press, deny it. That's consciousness of guilt. The president knew that he was doing something wrong. There was an extremely strong case for obstruction against the president of the United States.
Well, we can't say the word on any network or cable right now tonight, but I'm effed. Everybody knows what he's saying. There, it seems to be established his motive for cover-up and for obstructing justice. He says, if this thing goes forward, I'm dead. My presidency is dead. There's your motive.
And remember what the investigation was about. The investigation was about whether the Trump campaign had worked with the Russians to try to throw the election to Trump. And Trump says, if there's an objective investigation of that, my presidency is over.
It's pretty clear. Anyway, the report supports James Comey's version of events over the story offered by the president. It says, for instance, that substantial evidence corroborates Comey's account of that dinner invitation and the request for loyalty from the president. Remember that night? The report also affirms that the president fired Comey because of the Russian investigation. Quote, substantial evidence indicates that the catalyst for the president's decision to fire James Comey was Comey's unwillingness to publicly state that the president was not personally under investigation. Cynthia, it seems to me we've established motive here. The president didn't want to be caught for what he's done and all the things we don't know about he's done. I think those were all in his mind when he thought about, my God, an investigation into me, Donald Trump, who needs that? And now finding out that he particularly was afraid of the Russian investigation.
Right. And the report is written beautifully because it goes through each of these 10 charges and lays out exactly what the facts are, what was his intent, what is all the evidence. And it is, when you read it as any regular prosecutor reading this would say this is a prosecution memo, basically. If this guy's name was regular guy Trump, he would be indicted today, as opposed to President Trump. I mean, it is very clear from the reading.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What do you make of what charge?
Oh, the charge that the reason they didn't go, that it wasn't as bad as it could have been because a lot of the people around him, including his White House lawyer McGahn, refused to do what he told them to do.
That doesn't really have anything to do with an obstruction charge because you don't have to. The obstruction does not have to be complete. So to me, that's not much of an argument. I mean, it's sort of set.
Oh, I didn't mean that as an argument.
He's a very bad manager. But
for the Republic, I meant it's better off that they didn't follow what he told them to do because it would have been worse in consequence.
There's nothing but bad news for the Republic today. I mean, first of all, we have an attorney general who is deceiving us. We have a president who's completely out of control. We have a press secretary who lies to the press with impunity. There's no good news for the Republic in this, except that it's come out and it's being thrown to Congress.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.